There's been a lot that's happened in the HIV world in the last 40 years, and before we can talk about what our future looks like, we need to understand where we've come from. So here we go, a very high-level overview of the most important HIV milestones in the last 40 years in just around 5 minutes. While we now know it has been around for much longer, what we call HIV first came to the attention of the medical community in 1981. Initially identified as a rare cancer among gay men, it was originally called GRID, or gay-related immune disorder. This later became known as AIDS, and shortly after that, we identified the virus, or HIV. 6 years later, the first drug to treat HIV was approved by the FDA, AZT. AZT was originally developed as a cancer drug, and the evidence behind its efficacy for HIV was scant. Several scientists on the committee were opposed to approving it. It had tons of toxicity, and the positive effects were very short-lived. Now, that same year, building off decades of activism in the gay liberation movement, ACT UP, or the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, was formed to protest and force the federal government to respond to the growing pandemic. At this point, there had been no significant federal response, and the president refused to acknowledge HIV publicly. Finally, in 1990, after almost a decade, the federal government authorized the first significant funding to fight HIV, the Ryan White CARE Act, or Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act, named in honor of Ryan White, a teenager from Indiana who had become a public face and advocate for people living with HIV and had recently died from AIDS-related causes. Now, prior to 1993, the conditions that defined AIDS were based on what diseases were being seen among gay men. There was a mistaken belief that women didn't get AIDS, so nobody looked at how it manifested in women. Having an AIDS diagnosis was important because it was the only way to access medication or to access disability insurance. In 1993, the definition expanded to include several new opportunistic infections, including those specific to women. This saw a sharp increase in the number of people living with AIDS. Now, AIDS deaths reached a peak in 1995. It was the leading cause of death of men ages 25 to 44 in the United States. In 1995 alone, just under 49,000 people died from AIDS, almost 320,000 since the beginning of the epidemic. 320,000 artists and writers and teachers and politicians and doctors and freaks and role models. An entire generation of gay men and activists were lost to AIDS, and we will never know what the world could have been like if they were still here. 1995 fortunately saw the introduction of HAART, or highly active antiretroviral treatment, also called cocktail therapy. It was a literal lifesaver. You'll hear people from the time talk about the Lazarus effect it had almost instantaneously on those who were on the brink of death, and we saw a rapid and sharp decline of deaths within 2 years. However, HAART at the time was handfuls of pills multiple times a day, which wasn't easy to tolerate, to say the least. In 1996, the viral load test was approved, and for the first time, we were able to see how much of the virus was present in the blood and to tell when it was undetectable, which let us know that a medication was working and ultimately became the basis for our understanding of viral suppression and what that meant for passing on the virus. The 2000s saw the beginning of the Bush administration and significant additions to federal funding for abstinence-only sex education. Sex education in the 2000s and on meant requiring programs to say that sex outside of marriage was psychologically and physically damaging, and that you could only talk about contraception and safer sex methods to talk about their failure rate. Most significant was the community-based abstinence education funding, which went even further, prohibiting any other type of sex ed to exist in schools. So if you wanted federal dollars that also included school lunch funds, then the only sex ed in your schools had to be this specific kind of abstinence only. At this time, 50% of all new HIV diagnoses were among people under the age of 25. Now we start making some really amazing biomedical advances. First, in 2005, non-occupational post-exposure prophylaxis, or NPEP, was approved. For folks who had a condomless counter, now if they initiated a month of treatment within 72 hours of the contact, they could prevent HIV infection. Then in 2006, we had the biggest game changer for HIV treatment with the advent of the one pill once a day regimen, developed after 2 drug companies worked together to combine their 3 drugs into one tolerable pill per day. We went from handfuls of pills per day to 1. Next, in 2010, after years of studies, the FDA approves PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis. This means we now have one daily pill that will prevent HIV, the first time we've ever had anything other than condoms for prevention. This is huge and completely changes the way we talk about sexual pleasure in HIV. Also in 2010, the federal government issues the first national HIV/AIDS strategy with a focus to end the HIV epidemic by 2030. And last but not least, in 2017, after 3 decades of study and evidence, we can unequivocally state that a person on effective HIV treatment can't pass it on sexually, period. And again, we are on the cusp of a new sexual era, especially for communities who have been told to live in fear and stigma since 1981.